Hi guys, welcome back to F1 News. A potentially major blow for Sergio Perez's ambitions to retain his drive at Red Bull for next season, with Helmut Marko confirming that he will not, under any circumstances, be getting a multi-year extension to his deal. Red Bull no doubt are continuing to evaluate Perez's performance with respect to Carlos Sainz and potentially one Yuki Tsunoda. Very much and tweet your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, there is lots of problems right now with Formula 1 and the FIA, and we're going to discuss a couple of them that Adrian Newey has discussed, among others actually. So Verstappen, you'd think that if any driver on the grid that would love these regulations, Verstappen would be the man. But Verstappen doesn't even really like these cars, and that is the feature that every driver seems to have about the way the cars are so heavy. He even says the current cars still feel like a boat. They're fast nowadays, these cars, but they're so big, they're so heavy, they're so even at times laborious in some of the slower speed corners that even the Red Bulls that have been the case for the last few years, Verstappen still doesn't massively like them. And Adrian Newey says it's basically going to get worse in some regards. Certainly on the engine side, he actually made a really interesting point on what may occur at Monaco when, in 2026, we have the 50% combustion, 50% battery-powered hybrid deployment situation, because Newey says that effectively the ICEs, the internal combustion side, is going to turn into just a generator for the electrical power, because the electrical part, the battery, is going to be so power-hungry that the engine will effectively be charging it up during the lap. Now, in most circuits, that can exist today to some extent, but mostly that will affect circuits such as Monaco, because his opinion is that even in the Lowe's hairpin, the slowest corner on the entire calendar, the engine will still be working hard. Like, it will still be almost at maximum power through those corners and be going, flat chat, as he says, as generators just about the entire time. So he says that it's going to be a strange formula. I think what he really means is a stupid formula, to be honest, and what they're currently up to, these decisions have not maybe been the wisest. And even Newey goes on further and says the problem potentially on the battery and the electrical side is the cost, and he says, okay, maybe other production techniques in the future will help bring that down. But his actual point is that in order to have the high electrical power batteries that are required, they're not going to be standard road batteries. Like, the technology they're going to be using in Formula 1, in terms of battery chemistry, battery construction, is likely to be rather different to what a normal road car needs. So his point is basically like, guys, we're doing this whole thing to help the manufacturers so they can push their EV stuff that they want to do, and there's even an argument to be made as to whether that really is the wisest call over the coming years anyway. But also he's saying what we're going to do in F1 here isn't even going to be road relevant anyway, because we're using vastly different techniques and, construction of the batteries that a road car won't use. So his point is it's stupid and it doesn't make any sense, so let's just not do it. But the reality is that will be a thing for 2026. The question is how soon after that things will change. The other frustrating point about Formula 1 right now is some of Liberty Media's decisions, certainly with regard to this Concord agreement. One thing they might do pretty cool is the MotoGP F1 crossover. We know that they've now bought Liberty Media MotoGP as well. Hamilton's down for it, says that it would be epic to have a crossover weekend. He's a big MotoGP fan. This is a picture of Valentino Rosso and Lewis Hamilton, but Hamilton on the bike and Rossi in the car from a few years ago now. But this is the big story again of yesterday, one of the big stories going around about the Concord agreement. So they're going to re-sign a new deal next year where the teams effectively decide what goes on, what the rules are from the top-down level. They won't call it a franchise, but it effectively now is a franchise model, kind of like in American sports, when new teams can't simply come in. And apparently, this is outrageous to me. If this is true, maybe it's expected, but it's nonetheless frustrating that they are looking for a 10-team limit in the new Concord agreement. So they have rejected Andretti outright because they say, well, they don't add value to the sport. Although you look at teams like Sauber that can't do a pit stop to save their life. You look at teams like Haas that have no employees compared to other teams, and you say they're adding more value to the sport than Andretti may, with their massive ambition and their big American backing and big American General Motors backing as well. Doesn't quite add up to me. But this is what Joe Soward said in his latest notebook, that the current limit is 12 teams theoretically. No, we don't have 12. We don't even have 11. But the theoretical limit of the cap of the grid on teams is 12 teams as it stands. They are looking to reduce that to 10 straight up. So they no longer have to worry about another team coming in. And if any change was to be made on the grid, it would be a buyout situation. Because let's be real, if the limit went down to 10, they would be inflating the value of their own teams, right? I mean, this is kind kind of what it says in the article here, discussing changes to these commercial agreements and what that might potentially mean. Also a big discussion, of course, on whether teams will be allowed to own two teams, right? So whether Red Bull can continue to own RB or whether that's no longer going to be a thing. Zach Brown has pushed heavily for that not to be a thing anymore. He wants that to change, and I wouldn't be surprised if it does. But the other point, as Joe Soward says, is that most wish to see there only being 10 teams. So obviously Andretti fans, American fans will be frustrated with this, and he goes on to say that, well, maybe it makes sense because, Liberty Media, American corporation listed on the NASDAQ, but it's not necessarily an anti-American thing. It's more about the inflating of the own valuation of their teams, because if they can effectively make this a franchise league where there are only 10 teams allowed in the first place, then all of a sudden the value of those teams goes up, and they don't have to worry about other teams joining, needing to pay money to dilute the fees that would not be shared. It's one of those very frustrating confirmations, at least rumours right now. We haven't a confirmation of this yet, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's what they're discussing. And for all of what Formula One says in the public perspective, what is happening behind the scenes can sometimes be rather different, right? So deeply frustrating for sure, especially when you've got some teams that aren't doing their best to be competitive, some that want to but are not able to even get onto the grid as it stands. The only way for that to happen would, it seems in the near future, be to buy out another team. And if Haas never want to sell, which Gene Haas seemingly doesn't, then unlucky Andretti, you have no room for manoeuvre. Unless they buy Alpine, which right now looks like the most likely way that Andretti get into the sport in the near future. Because Formula One said, well, Andretti, we know we rejected you this time, but when General Motors come in with their engine in 2028, then maybe we'll let you in. But imagine that GM do that. They work hard for the 2028, coming into the sport, and then actually a new Concord agreement is signed that says, yeah, sorry, we're capped at 10. So unlucky, you can't come in anyway, guys. The rules are the rules, So that would be annoying. To be fair to Haas, however, they have started the season reasonably well. I think there's lots of discussion to be had on why and whether they can actually maintain this, because it seems like Ai Komatsu has come in and wow, the team all of a sudden is performing. Their car is competent. It doesn't destroy its tyres as it did for all of last season. Seems like Steiner gone, Komatsu in, has fixed their team. Now, it's never quite as simple as that. Whatever we are seeing at the start of the season was effectively the foundations were laid by Steiner over the last few months. Do I think that Komatsu is arguably a far better leader for the team from multiple angles? Quite possibly, yes. Despite being a massive personality, did Günther Steiner ever strike me as a particularly competent leader? Not necessarily. But I guess the question is whether they can maintain this level of improvement that they've seen since the start of the season. Even Dekesa here from Formula Uno says that the Haas could well have scored points in Suzuka as well, but they didn't quite set it up correctly. But it still performs well during the Grand Prix. I think the key thing that you definitely don't want to overlook here is the fact that, wow, what a surprise. Ferrari make major upgrades to their car, of which Haas buy everything they possibly can from last year to this year. Ferrari have fixed their tyre degradation issues. They're no longer just a qualifying team and struggle in the race. They now have, arguably, Ferrari, the best tyre deg on the entire grid. That was certainly the case in Suzuka. So it really shouldn't be a surprise that Haas also magically, all of a sudden, taking, the new rear suspension and these other elements, now also have far fewer tyre degradation issues than they previously did. So I think for now, I will more lean on the argument that they are benefiting from Ferrari's progress rather than the fact that Haas have somehow fixed their operation. All of a sudden, they're going to be increasingly a more competitive team as time progresses. But it still shows that when you do buy everything from a top team, that when they actually become a top team again, it actually is a viable prospect to not be the worst team on the grid. And that is pretty much what Haas want to try and achieve. Now, Hülkenberg, we're pretty sure he's going to go somewhere else, because actually, as we just mentioned here a second ago, Magnussen will be the driver to receive Haas's first upgrades in China. So they're bringing upgrades earlier than expected, which is fair play from an operational level, because Haas never used to do that. And if they work, wow, we are living in quite a different timeline. But Magnussen will get the upgrades first. Interesting just because Hülkenberg has been and continues to be the stronger driver, I would say, of the pairing. But maybe they feel, as maybe he feels, he's on his way to Audi. That is the current rumour, that Hülkenberg to Audi is going to happen at some point, and possibly that pen to paper is happening very soon indeed. Now, apparently he's got contract negotiations with several teams ahead of next season. There could even be interest from Mercedes, who knows, if as an outside possibility, but that seems rather unlikely to me. Audi, Sauber, makes the most sense in the short term, and that would leave that seat probably for Ollie Behrman, we believe, and then possibly Magnussen would stay, and maybe that's why he's getting the preferential treatment on the upgrades for now. But these are all the other drivers without contracts for next season. Gasly and Ocon are two drivers that I'm very interested to see how things go as well, just because I'm sure that one or both of those guys probably wants to get out of Alpine. They both had podiums last season with Alpine. This year, that ain't going to happen unless there are some crazy circumstances that occur. They have the worst car on the entire grid. Both drivers that I would say are solid, maybe even bordering on underrated. I would say both of those guys could probably improve teams further up the grid, but there just don't seem to be the options right now for those guys to jump ship to, although they should be names, I would say, in consideration slightly lower down the pecking order. The big question still to be answered, though, is what happens at Red Bull and with Carlos Sainz, because the rumour had it the other day, Sainz to Mercedes is definitely a possibility. Mercedes would be interested if they can come to terms with Sainz. Sainz might think, though, you know what? I'm driving very well. As time progresses, there's a good chance that Sainz starts to outscore Perez in terms of podiums if the Ferrari brings the upgrades they are expecting to bring to Imola and certainly beyond. But if we start to get Max, Charles, Carlos podiums with Perez in P4, for example, then all of a sudden that is quite the statement that if Ferrari continue to be very competitive next season with Red Bull, which they probably will on current trajectory, and the fact that they're going to have that incredibly enticing Hamilton-Leclerc pairing next year, there is an argument that Red Bull need a stronger, on a more consistent level, second driver to Perez, especially given that his qualifying has not been good. Pretty much until Suzuka, to be honest, right? Like, Perez's qualifying performances, we'll see them in a second, have been awful, like genuinely abysmal for the last 18 months pretty much. But just when he needed to show some form, he has come back to form. The question that Helmut Marko, I'm sure, and others have is whether this is actually sustainable, because Sergio Perez was asked this in Suzuka, like, what do you think about getting the contract extension? To be honest, I was convinced at some point last year he wasn't going to see 2025. Like, he was so bad during a point. Japan last year was shocking. Qatar was bad as well, like Singapore. I don't even want to go through those races because it's just bad memories thinking of how bad of a time Perez had. And I didn't think he was going to see this year. He has, and he's arguably doing well enough to maintain that for next year. But if Ferrari continue to show the progress they are, this is what we've said for some time. Red Bull at some point can't just rely on Max. And if Perez is 2/10 behind, that's fine. But if he's 5-6 behind and struggling to get into Q3, then that's a problem. So Perez wants an answer within a month, what's going to be happening here, and this is then what Helmut Marko said on the potential of giving Perez a longer or multi-year deal. If he has a secure contract for 2 years, there is a risk that he will slack off. So this again raises the question of what Helmut Marko really thinks of Sergio Perez, but also how much decision-making power Helmut Marko still has, because sure, 6-12 months ago, it was probably a different story internally at Red Bull to what it presently is. But yeah, Marko said, we have enough to overview what's going on. Audi apparently wants a decision soon. Everything is an option. Our team is currently working very well, at least that's what he says publicly. If he has a secure contract for 2 years, there is a risk that he will slack off. And to be fair, this is what Mercedes used to do as well with Valtteri Bottas. It does remind many, to be honest, of what happened last year when, well, basically, Helmut Marko made that rather famous statement now, saying the following, that we know that he has problems, this being Checo in qualifying, he has form fluctuations, he is South American. Now, of course, he's not South American, he's Mexican. We talked it in some depth at the time, but basically the implication there was from Marko that, well, because he's Mexican, or South American, as Marko described it, he doesn't have the temperament that a Max or a Sebastian does, for example, when he worked with those guys at Red Bull and continues to the present day. Marko apologised, said he's sorry. Perez then said, I accept your apology. You didn't mean it, and all this type of stuff. But now we're hearing Marko say, well, if we give Perez this 2-year deal, he might get comfortable, he might slack off. We don't want to see that. And I don't think there's anything, too bad in that, really, from Red Bull's perspective. It is expected, and it's the same thing that Mercedes did as well. They would just give Bottas a 1-year deal every year and keep him on, and it was massively stressful for Bottas, right, because he had to perform. But then again, you're a highly paid athlete at the very highest level of motorsport. You've got to perform when the pressure's on, and Bottas did a respectable job. So that seems to be what they're going to do with Perez if they decide to, right? They may not decide to keep him on entirely, But if they were to keep him on for another year for 2025, they will definitely not be giving him a deal for 25 and 26. So there are certainly other options they will want for them. I think there's no way that Perez is in the car in 2026, I don't imagine, because I think Red Bull will feel like brand new set of regulations, they're going to need somebody else. For next year, it is definitely a possibility, but it's maybe not even an especially likely one, because this was last year's qualifying stats. So Verstappen was in Q3 20 times. He was out in Q2 on 2 occasions. That was, of course, Singapore and, I guess, Jeddah, right, when he had the issues. Just comparing this to Perez, because given the strength of the Red Bull, and sure, last year the Red Bull was a great qualifying car, obviously, but it wasn't like an unbelievably dominant machine in qualifying on the pure numbers in terms of how much and how often Verstappen got pole by what sort of deltas. But Perez was outperformed in qualifying last year by Alonso, by Leclerc, by Sainz, by Hamilton, Russell, Norris, Piastri, and was outqualified on multiple occasions by Hülkenberg, by Albon, by Tsunoda, and by many others. Perez's stats last year, he was out in Q1 3 times, out in Q2 6 times, and made it to Q3 on 13 occasions, which was not great considering. If we have a look at 2024 here, of course, leave this link down below if you guys want to check it out. These are qualifying results this season so far. So Perez 5th, 3rd, 3rd, 2nd. So Bahrain wasn't great at all, but since then it's been getting steadily better. Probably helped to some degree by the fact that the Ferrari isn't the qualifying monster that it was last year, and maybe right now arguably neither is Leclerc. And in terms of Q3 stats, Perez through to Q3 on 4 occasions so far, as with many other drivers so far. So, no real concern for Perez on this data, but at the start of last season, it was a not dissimilar story. If we look at last year's qualifying results for Sergio Perez last season, he was 2nd, 1st, okay, 20th in Australia, better not talk about that, and then 3rd and 1st. So the start of last year for Perez in terms of results and for qualifying was also very solid, but pretty much from, Miami and beyond, it then fell away from him very quickly indeed. And this is what Marko is saying, that he's not sure that Perez has the consistency, and he's not sure that the fact that he's had 4 reasonably okay races, sometimes good, sometimes pretty mid, but good enough. Certainly Suzuka was a good weekend for Perez compared to Max. Marko isn't convinced that means that, Perez is back, he's fine, the fluctuations are over, and he's going to be hella consistent from here to the end of the year. I do think he is more likely to be this year than last year, because 21, 22, 23, Perez just got worse compared to Max every year. I think he eventually had to have the mindset of, I'm not going to be winning the World Championship. I think he felt that before he got smoked at Miami last year, Perez, and then, that was a pretty tough day for him, I'm sure, and it seemed to derail the rest of his season. This year, if Perez's mindset is, I'm not going to beat Max, I'll do the best I can to win the Constructors and get 2nd and everything alongside Max, that should help him, but I'm still not convinced that Perez is now going to be solid for the rest of the year. I still feel like there is all the chance in the world that Perez has a bad quali, pops in a stinker, and then that's when it might be Carlos Sainz's time to pounce, because Sainz maybe has to make some sort of a decision as to if there is a Mercedes offer as a bit of a stopgap to Antonelli, whether Sainz goes for it now or whether Sainz says, I'm quite happy with, where I'm at Ferrari. I'm very happy with how I look in the driver market. Sainz could maybe take 2, 3, 4 more races to say, right, I'm going to go out there every week and just try and beat Perez. That's the goal. Beat him in quali, beat him in the race, especially with the Ferrari upgrades. And if he was capable of doing so, that might put Sainz in a very attractive position for Red Bull if Ferrari keep getting closer to Max, which seems to be possible based on the way things are currently trending. So very much interested your thoughts in the comment section below. Of course, we also know that Helmut Marko rates Yuki Tsunoda very highly indeed and has been very, full of praise, shall we say, for Yuki's performances, his maturity, his pace over the last few races, and I don't know if Marko feels like Tsunoda can actually be a potential Max partner. I think he possibly does. I don't know if Horner feels the same way. And Marko, every time he praises Yuki, he then takes a bit of a step back and he says, he's really blossomed, but it's only April. Lots of races left to see. But of course, that kind of analysis also remains true for Perez, who's got to hold on to the seat. This I also did want to mention because Toto Wolff has basically said that Mercedes are now in a rebuild phase. I think he hasn't been this explicit for some time, but it's obviously clear what's happening. Mercedes have fallen off, and they're saying, it's all part of the plan, we're just rebuilding from the ground up. But what it does mean is that putting Antonelli in the car is actually quite low risk and maybe makes some sense, because it's not like Mercedes are like so much further ahead of Williams in performance. They're obviously better, but not as much better as they were several years ago, you could say. So the argument is that actually putting Antonelli into a car that's probably not going to be a title challenger is actually makes a fair bit of sense, as opposed to him replacing Hamilton in the prime Mercedes days. But very much intrigued your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.